Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Getting the point. As in, so this is another way to view the data so that you can pick it, it will jump at you or something. It's not very clear from here, I would say, what to pick. But why is it plateauing? I think so. What happens is, let's say I have something of size 14, a string of length 14. What happens is, the number of patterns I see of length 1 will be 14. The number of patterns I see of length 2 will be 7 or something. But let's say if I actually look at patterns of length 14, I just see one pattern. So the denominator will be very high, but the numerator is just 1. So that is a problem with the size of the data. But if you give me infinite data, that will be different. So all this plateauing and things is coming because of finiteness of data. Those are more technicalities. Let's not go into it. But did you get I would say, the broader idea of this? What's happening? But did you get, I would say, how we are extracting the encoding length for, I would say, for normal case, and then we actually have errors. Basically, how did we end? And so basically, what it's giving us is it's giving us more information. 1 second, and then we actually it's pushing the entropy down. Yeah, please go on. Yeah. I don't know actually. I don't know about it. Comment. Yeah. No. Yeah. So, okay, we started with something like this. Initially, we had, I would say, no clue about the data, but about the structure underlying the data. Then we made, we said basically it's probably fixed length encoding. And if it's a fixed length encoding, we came up with a scheme to actually look at patterns. And then we saw the count on number of patterns. Question? No. Okay. So you did a count on the number of patterns, and then you actually extracted the length at which basically you can actually see the most compact code, the least number of patterns that you need to represent it in that size. And then I would say, okay, we defined, I would say, another version of this code that is much easier to read, compactness gain. And then we said if I added noise and bit flips, my old score is not working because all the patterns show up. And now I said I'm going to modify this score, and then the way I'm going to exploit this, I'm not just looking at the count, I'm not just looking at if the pattern is appearing or not, but this time I'm looking at basically how many times it appears, because the patterns that appeared or showed up because of errors will not occur so frequently as the patterns that are in my data. That is what you want to exploit. And now what happens is that is captured in the, I would say, the entropy formulation. And when we do this, now you actually see your peak back again here. Sorry. Yeah, the peak is here and then here. And okay, this is for the compactness gain for, I would say, the corrected score, the entropy score. And then basically this red one is for the old score, which is actually giving the wrong one. So now we have actually extracted, I would say, some encoding length. Once we looked at the encoding length, basically we ran to this encoding length and we saw what are the patterns that occur more frequently. And here are the patterns, and what you see is basically these patterns match with your English, I would say, alphabets. So you actually got, you actually went down and basically got the structure of English, I would say some structure from the English language. So let's go to the next one. And here is a plot basically where you're comparing. Actually, what you have to read is basically here is the blue line is the English alphabets and ASCII alphabets, basically, I would say. Yeah, and basically the blue line is the English frequency, and this orange one is the patterns that we extracted. So, and we saw basically like what's the probability of their occurrence, and you see that basically, I would say, more or less, I would say the ones that you actually computed match with the English language. Okay, here we are quantifying it something called KL divergence. At this point, I would say you need not worry about it. It's a score to kind of try to see how close to probability distributions are. If the probability distributions exactly match, it will go to 0. If the probability distributions are really far, then that's really high value. So what you want to do is, as you kind of before learning, you actually have a very high score, but after learning it will go really low, and that is what is shown here actually. So you can actually, this plot shows basically what is the probability distribution that you got. If everything was completely random, you would have actually a flat line here, because basically all the probabilities would be equal, because you don't know what will occur with what, I would say, frequency. But once you actually kind of extracted the patterns and you actually look at the counts and your probability distributions, you saw that whatever you extracted basically matches with the distribution in English language. So, but now you can actually go ahead and, I would say, kind of try to expand on this and see what happens. But I would say, but let's kind of pause a bit and say basically what have we done? We took seemingly random data without any information on it, and then we made some assumptions and we kind of did some, I would say, some computation, and we got the underlying structure in the data, and that's what we did. And let's say if you actually have, let's say, the symbols, let's say the symbols are only, let's say for example, you have like, I would say, maybe 64 symbols or something, then you just need 6-bit encoding. Now you can re-encode it and make a compression code out of it, and people do this. Let's move to the next one. So what have we achieved? So basically what happened here was basically we actually made the formulation here in terms of entropy, this particular formulation. Where is this? I think I have to point this way, yeah. So here the formulation is in terms of entropy, and so so there are a lot of, I would say, codes that use this kind of a formulation that we didn't know before we actually came up with this. So we'll actually talk about some of them, and this is something called a sparse code. So what happens is, in a sparse code, what you're trying to do is, let's say for example, if I have only 2-bit encoding, let's say I just have to tell, well, let's say for example, if it is, let's say 1 or 0, then if this bit corresponds to 0, this bit corresponds to 1, then I will send something like this. Let us say for example, if it's a 2-bit encoding, then the size of the basis will be something like this. The first bit corresponds to if this is the case, or the second one corresponds to if this is the case, and so on. So if I have something like, let's say 0, 1, then the representation for this will be like this. Are you with me? Wherever I would say the location of this is. If it is, sorry, there's 1, 1, and so if it is 1, 1, then what happens is you get something like this. This is the representation that it goes. So the larger the size of the encoding, the bigger is the size of this. That's what happens. So if you actually want a compact basis, the number of, these are called the basis elements. They are doing the function of your coordinate system, x, y, z or something, and telling basically what's the component that they have. But if you want to shrink, you wanted to shrink the coordinate system because you don't want to transmit a lot of bits. So when you actually wanted to shrink this kind of a code, where basically the bases are very less number of elements, that is called a compact code. You actually wanted to kind of send the least number of bases, basically because you have to send this for each one of those elements. Let's say if you have 8-bit encoding means the size of this, the size of this vector, for example here, for 2-bit it is 4. For 8 bits, it will be 256. For each one of those patterns, I have to send a vector of size 256, and that is very, I would say costly. So basically, that's why basically compact codes are preferred earlier, because they want to send a really compact code. And the trivial code is basically you just have 2-bit encoding, 0 and 1. So you only send 2 bits. But people have found that is not efficient. So also, we'll actually see that. So what happens is, if you send them, basically the number of components that you need to send is very large. So what you can do is basically, our brain doesn't do compact coding, it does something called sparse coding. What it does is, it will use a lot of bases, but what it will do is basically, it will only be charged not for all of these digits, but it will only be charged for the number of ones it fires. So now what you do is basically, even if the basis is really large, what you want is, you want to minimize the number of ones it fires. That is the communication cost it incurs. If you use such a scheme, what you do is basically, actually this scheme actually in some sense is a scheme that actually minimizes the communication cost that you see here. Actually a dip occurs at 8 here. So these are actually plotted from the real data. So these codes are called sparse codes, and so the brain is actually doing this sparse coding, and so it wants to get a basis on which it can do a sparsest code. That's how it comes up with. So when you're actually looking at, I would say, compact code, here the basis functions are really small, the number of the sizes. Here the basis function can be, I would say, really large, but the number of firings it does, it wants to minimize. That's what it is, the difference. And now what we'll do is basically we'll see why this happens. So basically, and where this is used. Let's say I just showed you for, I would say, some textual data, and I showed how the encoding scheme is and what is the basis for doing this. The basis basically, that is the 8-bit patterns that you got. Now what you do is, let's say I have images. You see a lot of images, but then if you want to kind of represent these images, you cannot store every image. So what you are also looking at is, just the way you are looking for patterns in your, I would say, in the bit thing, you also look patterns in the, I would say, in the images, in the natural scenes. And what you will do is, you will compose any image with these patterns. So let us say you have, I would say, a patterns that, like say, for example, something like a square like this. So what you do is, this is equal to something like a line plus another line here and plus another one plus another one. So you can actually compose this. So what you are asking is, you are asking what are these components that are actually in the brain. And actually people found out, but that as an actually the experimental neuroscience actually found out how they look like, and this is how they look like actually. But then this is not from experimental neuroscience, but they actually did sparse coding the way I told you, minimizing the communication costs, and they also arrived at the same thing. The way images are represented is using this basis, and these are called Gabor filters. And when you do, I would say, image recognition, let's say facial recognition and things like that, or you want to classify a dog versus cat, you will use convolutional neural networks. When you use the convolutional neural networks and try to train them and see what are the filters in the first layer, you will actually see these things again. So this is how your brain encodes the first level of information that comes in, first level of filters. Is that clear? So what we started off was, basically we started with bit strings and we said what are the patterns, and we came up with the principle of sparse coding. And then we said, oh, where else has sparse coding been used? And the answer is basically sparse coding is used for our brains to, I would say, try to look at the basis for images. And the question you can ask is it used somewhere else? And the answer is yes. So basically it is used the way you encode sounds. What this means is, when a sound comes in, the basis that it decomposes is not sines or cosines. It's a variant of sines and cosines. It's a bounded of sine and cosine. So these are basis, one is for natural sounds and other ones for I would say speech or something, but they are very similar. So what happens is, sparse codes, as we know them, are actually codes that minimize communication costs and are actually underlying the brains when they are actually trying to figure out what are the basis to represent different kinds of modalities. Okay, we have actually seen in terms of language is artificial, but if you actually look at, because we humans constructed it, but if you actually look at images or audio, in both cases you see the same principle coming up again and again. Is this clear so far? Okay, I think so. So let's kind of okay, let's revisit our questions. So basically, how to make sense out of the data. The way to make sense out of the data for humans, at least, basically the way the brains do it is they use sparse coding. They want, basically, I would say, spend as least energy communicating as possible, and they want the codes to be able to do that. How do they figure this out? We don't know, and that is the question that we want to ask. But then sparse codes are underpinning a lot of your the way your brains work. Second thing is, basically, what are the rules that govern, as in how do these people, how the brains actually try to figure out these codes is not very clear. And then when we looked at this, we are doing all this computation, but all the computation is happening through wiring in the brain or rewiring the brain. So how does this rewiring happen? So all of this is open. So what I just showed you is, I showed the first slide where you actually implanted something and you are asking, basically, I'm getting a random data, how to make sense out of it. But then basically this, I said basically it's trying to rewire itself, but I didn't tell you how it rewires. But as in, you can talk to me after the talk, but I'll just show a quick simulation of how we show something here. And the third thing is, basically, when it's rewiring, the networks are nowhere close to the kind of networks that you see in artificial neural networks. They are very different networks and they have simplicial structure, but we cannot explain. So basically that representation has to come from topology. Another question, basically, how does it make, I would say, sense of 3D perception out of 2D objects? That also I did not explain, but a lot of these are open questions actually. So what I just showed you was, out of all the questions that we raised initially, I just showed you how to attack the first one. I'll just run through the results of the second one now. And let's kind of quickly go through this. So what I have here is, let us say there's a circle here and all the points in this circle should be classified as 1. All the points outside the circle should be classified as 0, let us say. So now I don't know what network to use, what to do or something. But then, so here I'll say, okay, my inputs here are x and y. You give me an x and y point, and then I actually look at z. So what you do is basically, generally what you can do is you can say something like x minus, let's say something like xc the whole squared plus y minus yc the whole squared. If this is greater than minus 5 or something, let's say circle. If it is greater than 0, I will say it's one class 1. If it is less than 0 or equal to 0, I say class 2. This is how you do. But then, but let's say for example, my network doesn't know anything about this. I just give it data points. How would you do? So basically here is basically a small simulation of how, what you see here is the plot. Initially x and y directly connected to the output node. But actually, if you actually look at this plot, accuracy is like random. So basically it's around 0.5, 0.6. But as in, don't worry about these two plots. But what you see here is, as the plot progresses, as the evolution progresses, what you see is the network has, I would say, converged to something, and your accuracies are hitting almost like 100% here, very close to 100%. So basically, so here we use information theory guidance, but what I'm trying to say is it is possible to actually evolve networks. I just set the rules of the game and let it evolve. It will automatically evolve. If you have something like y is equal to f of x, I will put x, I will put y, and then now your box should give me what this f of x is. So this is one such box. So basically you kind of give me what is the input, what is the output, and there's some transformation between the input and output, and it will automatically rewire itself and tell me basically, it will not exactly function, but for example in network terms, the network will approximate the function. So questions. So this is an example for the second question. Basically, how does the brain rewiring itself and things like that. This is one way to rewire. I didn't go into the details of how this works, but at least we have, I would say, some idea of how to do this. But the remaining questions are still open. Yeah. Any more questions from you guys? Are you with me? Are you lost? Yeah, please.
So this only happens with the qubit gradient, or it also happens with our...
No. This one basically, right now, basically, this is not there in the ANN community. This is an algorithm that we developed in the lab. But I would say this is one way to do it, but there is no, I would say, way to say that this is the only way that the brain does. Probably there are other ways it does it, but this is one thing that we could think of. Yeah.
So you kind of work with algorithms to figure out how the brain works.
We don't have an algorithm for how the brain works. I think that's there's a lot of billions of dollars spent on this research. So people don't understand. But what people try to do is, they will try, let's say I showed you something like a log polar transformation, for which basically if an image is rotated or scaled down, then the map is like just a translation little bit. So you let's say you see this in the brain. As in, the interesting question to ask is, how is the brain knowing how to transform that? As in, it's a very powerful transformation that's able to do invariance, but how does it know how to do that? I don't know how it does it, and it's not even doing algebraic computation, it's doing topological computations. The network does it. How does it do that? We don't know. But what people do is, they'll take this transformation and they'll use it in, I would say, some kind of a image processing algorithms, because it's very handy. So right now the research community, where they are at right now is, they will do these experiments, they will take this insight, they will plug them into some image processing algorithms or deep learning algorithms and get efficient algorithms or efficient computation. But we are no way close to, I would say, saying that how the brain works, how does it learn. We are very, very far off. So I think I would say basically the area will be open for another 40-50 years. It's very fertile area. Yeah. So maybe I'll see you and you'll come and tell me. Sorry, go on.
Sir, you said about the similarity between the auditory and the visual signals.
Yeah.
So is that why the first slide where you explained about the auditory and the optic nerves is being the
So that's not the first, right? So basically that's like the, I would say, that's almost like the third or fourth ring, no? So what is happening is basically the auditory, what is happening is in this particular case, right? So what is happening is here the red one here is the pathway for auditory processing, and then the blue one is the pathway for vision processing. So you have, I would say, rewired the pathway so that the blue one goes into the red one. That means the vision is going into auditory cortex.
So is this rewiring possible because of the similarity between the auditory and the visual signals that
No, even if they are different, basically what happens is the brain automatically learns the transformation. It learns, looks like. So, but generally at the core, if you look at the way the data is represented, everything is spike trains. So, the visual data and the auditory data, everything at the core is represented as spike trains, just the way we use zeros and ones. So, it's used at the code is spike trains. We don't understand how that code works, but
what is it called?
it's called spike trains. Spike trains. What you see is basically the neuron is not doing anything for some time, and suddenly it spikes. Then it goes and spikes, and then it goes. Yeah. So on and so forth. So the spike trains is the code for the brain, just the way you use zeros and ones to represent something. So that's all it does. Yeah. So when you say, let's say X I cap, Y J cap, you know where to go, what it means, right? So because you look at this, where is X axis? I'll travel. I would say X units on the X axis, Y units on the Y axis, and then this is my point. You're getting the point. And so similarly, what it does is the code basically has, I would say, if the spike happens, it corresponds to this basis. It will try to compose using all of that stuff. We don't understand that code. We are nowhere close to understanding it yet, but it will take some time. But yeah. Sorry.
Passcoding matrix type of thing.
Yeah.
Is it a matrix multiplication?
No, I'm just what I'm trying to say is basically, let us say if you want to send a code basically of one bit encoding, then if I want to send basically, let's say 0 or 1, then what I'll do is I'll have two rows. If I put a 1 in the first place, that means basically I'm sending a 0. If I put a 1 in the second row, that means basically I'm sending a 1. But then if I have 2 bit encoding, then now my space is 2 square, because the first bit can take 2, the second bit can take 2. 2 square, that's 4. So basically I'll have a vector of size 4. The first bit there corresponds to 0 0. If the first bit is 1, that means it corresponds to 0 0 element. If the second bit is 1, that corresponds to 0 1. The third bit is 1, it corresponds to 1 0 or 1 1. So I'm trying to convey to the other party what is the information there, right? So I just send packets like this, and they'll construct 2 bits at a time, and make this whole thing. You're getting the point? Yeah.
You create 4 2-bit patterns.
So yeah, 4 2-bit patterns, and so basically if you have n, the total number of patterns you'll have is 2 power n, and then the size of this vector will be 2 power n.
So for an 8-bit pattern, how big was the vector?
It's 2 power 8. That's 256. Yeah.
What is happening differently in sparse coding?
So what's happening is differently in sparse coding is when you're actually sending compact codes, you want the basis to be less. When you're looking at X, Y, Z, so instead of sending 200, I would say points or 300 points, I shifted my coordinate system and sent 200 points. That is what I did, right? So now what I'm trying to say is, I'm not talking about how many bits I'm sending or something, how many numbers I'm sending. I'm talking about how many ones I'm sending, let's say. So what that means is, even if my basis is really large, basically instead of 256, let's say it's not even 256, let's say it's 5000 or something. I'm just putting a number. But then I'm not counting the size of my vector. I'm just counting how many spikes are in this vector. So in one case, you look at the size of the vector and you want the vector to be as small as possible, because you count for all the elements. In sparse code, you don't see the size of the vector. You will see how many ones are in the vector. The brains are doing the second thing, because the energy cost is for the spiking only. Whenever it's 0, it doesn't cost anything. So you can just rest, that's it. Questions?
So if the brain is able to convert the input we receive into output in the brain, how do we convert the input generated in the brain as output?
No, I'm not getting your question. Sorry.
So now if I see the pen, I'm converting the input I see as output and transmitting it via this 8-bit pattern in my brain.
No. So you're not. It's not exactly 8-bit pattern. So when you see a pen, what it does is basically it will get decomposed into the filters I showed you. Basically, a pen will be represented as a linear combination of these filters, and then for each filter there will be some neuron that's firing, and then they'll compose them at the end. That's what happens. Yeah. So now what's your question?
Now, if I want to draw the pen in my book,
Yeah.
how does the brain convert this image of pen that I have in my mind as output?
So what happens is when you have I would say, a memory of image. So what it does is basically probably, I'm not saying this is how it's done. I think this is what happens. So what happens is, it probably draws on the memory, and that memory gets converted into some kind of activations on the filter space, and then that is what basically gets sent to the motor cortex. Motor cortex is when your movements happen, and that is what draws. So basically, so you'll not exactly draw the exact pen. You'll actually have an abstract idea of what a pen is, and you'll draw that. To draw this pen exactly as it is, you need all the details of that pen, which you don't have. So basically, when you're not storing all the information. You're storing the most crucial information and discarding a lot of important. So basically, you have an abstract idea of a pen, and that is what comes onto the pen. Yeah.
The same filter type.
I think so. I'm guessing that's what happens. I think, but the memory gets pulled from there, and then the filters come on. I think so, but I'm not sure. Yeah. Questions?
Give some values of 5 to their
You give values
values
of
of 5.
5.
5 values.
Oh.
But then we don't give it the formula. And then we ask it to learn it and generate new values. Will it be able to? But can never even
The thing is basically, I don't know, it might be able to. The thing is, let's say, for example, if you look at, maybe it does. I don't know. Maybe it does. The point is basically, at the end, what your brains are doing is basically they are pattern recognition engines. At all points of time, that's what's happening. So you're actually looking at the recurring pattern and trying to replicate it across. So if you actually look at, let's say, e power x or something, right? Your brain does, I would say, exponential transformations really well. Logarithmic transformations really well. We don't know how it does, but it does. So if you actually give, say for example, if you have a string of numbers and then there's some pattern in it, so you can always construct a machine that can actually color out the patterns if you give it enough representation power. It is probably possible. Yes, it is probably possible. Yeah. That's speculation at this point, but probably it's possible. Same rules apply. Any more questions? Okay, I think then the question for all of you is basically, I think at the end of the day, what all of this kind of boils down to is, in all of this, either you are looking at patterns for basis, or you are looking at some transformations that will make your, I would say, some work easy. In the case of the example that we saw, the cost of communication is what it's trying to optimize on. In the case of log polar thing, it's actually doing the transformation so that it can do transformation. For example, compare invariances. For example, if it's actually translating or scaling or basically rotation or something, how can it do all these comparisons very easily? So at the end of the day, what a brain is doing is trying to look at patterns, and it's trying to look at these transformations and kind of deconstruct them or invert them and kind of enable these invariances. But none of the circuits, what are the circuits that are underpinning this is not known. So all of these are open questions, and all this area will be open for, I would say, for a really long time actually. There are a lot of interesting stuff. So at the end, it is a pattern, I would say in some sense it's like a pattern recognition machine or pattern matching machine. It's trying to identify these patterns, that's what it's trying to do. And trying to make functions or transformations appropriately to deal with patterns. That's what it is. Okay, we can close for today then. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Reducing the cost of communication.
That's right.
If so, why doesn't the right brain control the right part of the body and the left brain control the left?
That I don't know. Probably there's some evolutionary reason. I don't know. Maybe. Yeah. But it is known that the wiring length wiring length and cost of communication are at the crux, but we don't know why that happens. Cross wiring, I don't know. Maybe there's something. Yeah. Okay, I think if there are no questions, I think we can close. I think we are over time. Yeah. Thank you for being a nice audience, and yeah, thank you. Okay, bye. Yeah. Sure, sir.
I'd like to propose a vote of thanks.
Sure, go ahead, please, sir.
Thank you for taking time to your busy schedule to address us. I speak for everyone when we say that we love this and we learned a lot of new things about sparse coding, compact coding, and a lot of other things. I can say that we learned a lot about unsupervised learning under your supervision. Thank you so much. We'd love to listen to more of this,
Sure.
hopefully. And I'd also like to thank the RSI management, the teachers, and the technical staff here for conducting us. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all, and thank you, RSI organizers. Thank you all, and I would like to thank the RSIC organizers for having us here, and to meet all you wonderful people. A lot of interesting questions. Some questions I haven't thought about. So Professor Balakrishna was telling me, be ready for a lot of questions. I'll ask them to harass you or something. Okay, it was not a harassment, but it was interesting. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Yeah. It's done.